Oh. Hmm. The hydrocodone, which the doctor prescribed for him, having now once more begun to wear off. The painful throbbing pulse in his shoulder once again beginning to mount. Jack twisted off the cap from the small amber-colored plastic container of dwindling pills. When you've run out of the amount of pills I've prescribed for you, Mr. Bayfield, the emergency room physician had told him, you'll need to rely on ibuprofen from then on. No more than 3 at a time, mind you. I've given you a 3-day supply of hydrocodone. The pain you're undergoing will hopefully have subsided by then, but if it does not, then call me at the number I've given you. Thanks, Dr. Foster. Thanks for stitching me up, and especially for plucking the bits and pieces of bone out of my shoulder. Now, about your shoulder, Mr. Bayfield, you're not going to have full use of your shoulder for a period of time. Recovery rates always vary, of course. I'm going to advise you to make an appointment to see a physical therapist when you feel up to it. Are you much of a weekend athlete, Mr. Bayfield? Oh, not really. My preference in sports runs to horse racing as a spectator in the stands. Well, then you don't have to needlessly overstrain yourself by playing a round of golf or bowling a few lines. You'll need to avoid any sort of strenuous activity entirely. The only thing I'm worried about is not being able to write anything down for a while. I'll have to start using tapes, I guess. I'll have to dust off that old tape recorder of mine. Now, that's an easy solution, the doctor said. In time, you should regain most, if not full use of your shoulder. Later on in life, you may begin to feel the effects of arthritis in that area. Good luck. The doctor laid a gentle hand upon Jack's injured shoulder and gave the comedian a sad smile. With that, Jack was then transported, while seated in a wheelchair, down an elevator to the hospital lobby's main sliding glass door exit. His friend Jordan Fisher was just outside, waiting in his 4-wheel drive. Jack would be staying at the Fisher house to convalesce as the full use of his shoulder slowly returned to him. Of course, a little more than a week had passed when Jack and Lillian began an intense affair initiated by a spontaneous round of sex in the shower stall after Jordan had gone to work. People will catch their pleasures from time to time, if they're so inclined. Grandpa, I thought I'd caught it. Oh boy. This is Erica speaking. Grandpa, I thought I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke a moment ago, and here you are, sitting on the floor next to the fireplace like a teenager. Have a seat, Erica. Theo patted a portion of the carpet next to him in front of the fireplace. Erica had insisted that he sleep on the couch rather than drive back home. Between the bottle of champagne Theo had brought along, plus a few nightcaps Erica had provided from a bottle of Canadian Mist, he had gotten properly and irrefutably drunk. Erica would not permit him to drive back home. I'll get some blankets and a pillow. You're sleeping here on the couch tonight, Theo, and no arguments. She smiled and shook her head and lowered herself down beside him. How long have you been sitting here? She asked, crossing her legs tailor fashion beneath her bathrobe. She was wearing pajamas and hadn't worried about exposing herself while sitting down on the floor. Oh, I don't know, maybe half an hour. You miss her sometimes, don't you? Sure, I miss her. But you still have to live. Everyone left around has to live. After a pause, she said, I thought over your offer, Theo. Well, I don't see much on the downside at all, so my answer is a tentative yes. Good, that's good. But before we start moving furniture over to your place, there's something we should really talk about. Oh, I agree, he said. You bet, let's clear the air. Even though you're 67, rapidly approaching 68, Theo reminded her proudly. Okay, well anyway, you're still a good-looking man. You're still strong and fit. You still have most of your hair, and you still don't wear glasses, although I know you should. Well, I've been calling around recently about prices and what all's involved. Now that, I'm glad to hear. You can lead a mule to water, Erica, but sometimes the son of a bitch won't lap up a drop. Not a single drop, he said. She drew in a breath and said, Theo, what I want to say is that we can't let ourselves, well, you know, be attracted to one another. Oh, I know that all too well, he said. But in one respect, at least, it's already too late. What do you mean, too late? What do you mean, saying that? Do I have to spell it out for you, he said, feeling as though he were agonizing. Yes. Okay, then. You're a pretty woman. There, I said it. Now, are you satisfied? Yes, but do we understand each other? Sweetheart, I truly hope so. The following day, Sheila sat down at her desk and then paused before she reached over to the computer resting on the floor to switch it on. She kept thinking, Bernie couldn't have been any more clear in his position toward the idea of my having a baby. And I know he loves me, I'm not questioning that. But I could tell he felt nervous about it too. He's a serious man. We get along very well together. So if he wants to get married in the near future, that's fine with me. But we're not going to have a big wedding. In fact, we won't have anything more than a strictly civil ceremony. I think he knows I wouldn't want a big shindig in a church with me wearing a big flowing wedding gown just to get hitched. Ain't gonna happen, not with this girl. Fuck convention. Her friends were going to find her news about her upcoming marriage very exciting. Joan and Cindy and Clara, they all were gonna flip when they heard about it, she thought. But then there's Mother. No doubt she's gonna be heartbroken when she finds out that I've skipped all the falderall and just got it done, just as she's been hoping I would for years now. And recently, for some reason, my God, I don't dare risk even giving her a call these days. She never fails to mention it. You still seeing Jack? She would ask. When are you going to realize he's just a bum, Sheila? Didn't you once tell me he doesn't even have a car? And didn't you also tell me that he barely manages to support himself by traveling around on the bus, telling jokes in bars and saloons? What kind of a home life would that be? Wake up, Sheila. That Jack of yours is never going to amount to anything. Why do you persist in staying with him? That's what I'd like to know. Sometimes her mother drove Sheila crazy. She could do with far fewer of that woman's cherished opinions. Jack Bayfield becomes a minor celebrity. For a brief period of time, immediately after the fatal mass shooting incident at the Spokane Comedy Club, Jack Bayfield became national news. Once out of the hospital, he not only began to suffer in full measure the physical discomforts of recovering from serious bodily trauma, but he also had to suffer the indignities of being at the center of a sensational news story, hounded by legitimate journalists as well as self-appointed bloggers, and most persistent and egregious of all, the pack of paparazzi who hung around him for several days until about a week later when, one morning, the street in front of the Fisher home was suddenly absent of any vehicles other than those belonging to their neighbors. Just before going to work, Lillian pulled aside the curtain hung in front of the living room picture window facing the street, a habit she had fallen into after Jack had moved in. The day Jack was released from the hospital, these news reporters, photographers, and curiosity seekers had formed a small mob in front of their house. she flung the curtain shut in fuming disgust and outrage. "They're all vultures out there," she thought. A moment later, Jack came up the stairs from the spare bedroom and said good morning to Lillian. He then said, "I expect you're on your way to work right now." "Yes, I'll have to leave in a few minutes, but just getting out of here this morning is going to take some tricky maneuvering. Have a look out the window, Jack." He joined her next to the end of the sofa by the front door, pulled the curtain back just a few inches and peered out. A crowd of people were standing out there, every one of them a dedicated rubbernecker in one form or another. He let go of the curtain and looked at Lillian. "I see what you mean," he said. Jordan had already gone on one of his interminable errands, driving all over town as though he were already the big-shot politician he was banking on to become. She held Jack's gaze and now looked at him in a way which was hardly ambiguous. Her look told him that she wanted to fuck, pure and simple. Of course, Jack was all for that, even though he would be fucking the wife of his best friend. During the second of the 3 days Jack spent at the hospital, quite unexpectedly, Erica, along with her 2 children, had come to visit him late in the afternoon. The intravenous pain medication he'd been receiving, morphine at a slow drip, plus periodic injections of nocturnamine the nurses gave him every 6 hours, left him in a less than fully conscious state. Where was I? Oh, state of mind. Later, he couldn't be sure that their visit wasn't merely a dream. Tears filled his eyes when he saw how much his daughter Susie had grown. Her 9-year-old brother Leland as well. Whenever he was back home in Spokane for a brief few days, he rarely saw them. In turn, they continued to feel abandoned by him. He ignored them. Jack even admitted this to himself. He had given up being their father after the divorce. For Erica, every moment of that visit had been awkward. The children had no wish to see him, although they were both saddened and fearful that their dad had been seriously injured from a gunshot wound. They both had said that they did not want to go with her to the hospital, but she had insisted. They go. Beginning with Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales, and perhaps long before that, an individual life was often thought of as a long journey with several unexpected turns and forks along the road. Jack, Sheila, and Bernie, all 3 of them, have recently experienced the ongoing sense of an unexpected turn of events, such as meeting someone new who subsequently becomes important to you, or very important to you, even at the height of importance in a personal way, as in meeting one's future marriage partner. But only the most raving, utterly earnest romantic would say to a girl only minutes after meeting her that she would be his bride in days to come. But love at first sight is not a myth. This experience has happened to people countless times. Yet this time-worn expression disguises the actual feeling involved. Not what it claims to be, but what it actually is. Desire. Raw physical desire. This love at first sight is merely biology at work. The story of romance is never very interesting without the intrusion of some difficulty which must be faced and overcome if the relationship has any hope of continuing. Sheila, having once been married herself, knew all too well that some difficulties in the union between a man and a woman, which no one can put asunder, are never surmounted and therefore never go away. with the marriage's disintegration a certainty. Yet she was willing to take that risk with Bernie. Bernie, on the other hand, he'd never been married. A man in his early 40s, he always remained a bachelor, if not a solitary one. And he now kept thinking that he and Sheila would no longer merely be sharing the same apartment and the same bed. Those circumstances would continue unchanged, but by marriage a seal would be placed upon them, the requirement that the two of them remain together. This far more profound than a simple expectation. From time to time, Bernie would wonder, why do people fight in the first place? What draws a man and a woman into such pitched battles against one another? Of course, he'd been in several relationships with women before, although not one of them had brought him to the altar. Now, with Sheila, he knew that this time was different. Quite so. He would marry Sheila and take pleasure in doing so. Still, perhaps, the little lingering sense of trepidation, and he would remain with her gladly. He would remain with her. Justine sat down in her favorite armchair for reading and opened Bernie's most recent letter, having just arrived that day earlier in the afternoon. Each Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, days when she wasn't obligated by her teaching duties to drive into Bellingham, around 3 o'clock she would set out upon a brief hike to the mailbox located next to the turnoff from the county highway to her property. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, of course, on her way home from work, as soon as she'd taken the turn onto her private road, she'd park the car near the drainage ditch, then walk a short distance to the mailbox to collect her mail. Now, she could have rented a post office box in town at the on-campus postal station, but she had rejected that idea just after she'd bought the house 17 years ago. It became an ideal rendezvous point for her and Leonard Youngers to meet and make long, leisurely love in the late afternoon in a place where they had absolute privacy. The growth of trees around her old farmhouse kept a portion of it completely hidden from the county highway skirting the edge of her property. Her house was well secluded. She valued her privacy above every other concern in her life, some of these by which she was truly afflicted, matters over which very few people have any control, a harsh winter storm, for example, or mounting inflation, or the imminence of America's next military engagement, either declared or undeclared, or the arthritis which was slowly crippling her body. So she now read with no little surprise that Bernie and Sheila planned to get married next month. Would she care to visit Seattle and be their only guest as well as their witness during the brief civil ceremony a municipal judge would conduct with perfunctory efficiency and a congenial good wish for their future happiness, as Bernie had phrased it? Of course she would go. There was no question of that. Her first most important relationships included the one she had with Bernie, whom she thought of at times as the son she never had. Her scholarly work, along with the courses she taught, left her little time for routine socializing. In fact, her academic career and the semi-formal relations she had with both colleagues and students served as both the basis and substance of her social existence. Apart from Bernie and her mother, and unhappily, the old bird was slipping further into dementia each week, which is how often Justine saw her. Once a week, each Friday afternoon, both mother and daughter lived alone, and she thought it was pointless to do so any further, provided she retained her health, which all along had been quite good, with only rare visits to the gynecologist, mostly during her onset of menopause. She wrote a letter back to him that evening after she'd eaten dinner. January 15th, 2022. Dear Bernie. What a surprise! Yes, I would be more than delighted to play the role of witness. I'll treat you two to dinner afterwards, and by way of both a wedding gift and celebration. Such a pivotal moment the day one gets married, though one I will never experience, I'm sure. You and Sheila will be the ones who remain in my life when I'm old, perhaps along with one or two friends here in Bellingham, along with a handful of others I've met around the country over time during my career. But, Bernie, I want you to be well aware of this. At present, I do not see myself as on the brink of retirement, along with the resulting consequence of the sheer absence of work and the consequent new abundance of leisure time, which would soon overcome me with a sense of both mounting boredom and gloom. I've already begun planning a study of Susan Langer, a student of Ernst Cassirer. She wrote philosophy in a new key back in the mid-1950s, which was intended for a general audience. One need hardly be a dedicated student of philosophy to appreciate it. Basically, it was her introduction to an American reading audience of Cassirer's thought, which the Swiss thinker elaborated at great length in his multi-volume masterwork, The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. So, between taking care of my mother and this book on Langer that I'll be working on, I'll have plenty to keep myself occupied. Oh, and I can't forget the occasional repairs I have to make around the house. But after you get married, the two of you must come see me again. Your last visit here was such a pleasure for me, and I did enjoy meeting Sheila and getting to know her some. Bye for now, Bernie. I wish you and Sheila every happiness. All the best. Justine.